Lisa Francis was trying to drive home from her job at a bank in Lahaina when the firestorm caught up to her. It was 5 p.m. on Tuesday, the New York Times reported, and she was trapped in traffic near the ocean. Whipped by bruising winds, the firestorm was raging its way west toward her and others in similar straits. She looked at the long column of abandoned cars ahead of her on Front Street and knew there was only one place to go, toward the water. A stranger rallied her and a small group of similarly stranded people, exhorting them to climb over the knee-high seawall and take refuge on the strip of rocks along the water below. They clambered onto the slippery rocks. The fire roared through the cars and buildings on the street above them, unleashing a choking wall of thick smoke. The oven-like heat pushed them farther down to the water's edge. Facing the ocean, she clung tightly to a large boulder, afraid of being swept away by the crashing waves that were protecting her from an unrelenting shower of burning embers. A big wave would come and relieve us, Miss Francis, 54, a Hawaiian native who has lived in Lahaina for 31 years, said during a phone interview on Friday. A big wave would come and relieve us. So the waves, really, the ocean took care of us. From the ground, reporters continue, the devastation wrought by the fire that leveled Lahaina this week might look familiar in a world where intense, fast-moving blazes have become more common. The blackened tree trunks, the burned-out cars, the piles of debris. But from a helicopter flying overhead, the magnitude of the fire's damage took on a surreal quality. The ashen landscape collided with the turquoise blue of the sea. And the buildings that were still standing jumped out like color photographs superimposed on a black and white map. Officials warn that the confirmed death toll from the Maui fires, 93 as of Saturday night, will rise as responders begin entering the hundreds of charred buildings. But the fires have already taken more lives than a tsunami on the Big Island did in 1960. Is nature friend or foe? Savior or destroyer? The ocean took care of those who entered the waters to escape the wildfire. But when tsunamis hit, the roles are reversed. Sometimes the uphill forests save lives. In her poem, Oliver claimed the reliability and the finery and the teachings of this gritty earth gift. The finery and the teachings, yes. The reliability less so as climate change advances and climate emergency becomes a more accurate name. What is our relationship to nature in this time of climate emergency? Again from the New York Times. Jennifer Pribble was asleep when the power line fell in the forest. She heard the generator kick in, but didn't think much of it. High winds sometimes led to electricity failures. It was normal enough. Wildfires were not even on her radar. Ms. Pribble lives at the Maui Bird Conservation Center, where she helps care for some of the most critically endangered birds in the world. Hawaii's native birds have been decimated by disease fueled by climate change and by introduced predators like rats. The center keeps some 80 birds in enclosures in an effort to prevent their extinction and one day hopefully return them or their descendants to the wild. The center houses about 40 akikiki, a native songbird, and about 40 alala, also known as the Hawaiian crow. Alala are extinct in the wild, and only about 5 akikiki are known to remain. The only other members of these species live at the center's sister facility on the Big Island, said Emily Senninger, a spokeswoman for the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance. The birds are divided between both places to ensure against disasters like this one. But until now, they thought volcanic eruptions and hurricanes were the biggest dangers. As Ms. Pribble watched the fire in the distance, she felt reassured that it was in the forest, where a bed of thick pine needles seemed to be making it hard for the flames to spread. For a time, they actually reduced in size. But she grew increasingly worried as fire approached grasses closer to a road. If it crossed, the grasses on the 46-acre property would provide ample fuel. Rising temperatures appear to be contributing to reduced rain in Hawaii, climatologists say, and more than a third of Maui County is in moderate or severe drought. A neighbor came over to see what was going on, and while he was there, the fire started climbing the hillside toward them. All of a sudden, the fire jumped the road, and it was on our property, she said. We went out with fire extinguishers and kept it under control the best we could, just so it didn't cross back over the road until the state firefighters could arrive. She didn't think about how the birds she was protecting were among the last of their kind. She said she just acted, doing all she could to keep the facility safe. State firefighters arrived about 40 minutes later, as fast as possible. Luckily, the smoke blew mostly away from the birds, which were moved to the safest enclosures and appeared to have escaped any harm. It may seem strange that I lift up a story about a bird sanctuary when more than 1,000 people are thought missing and 93 people lost their lives in the deadliest wildfire in the US in over a century. Yet it is our human relationship to nature that is the biggest contributor to climate change. And it is our human relationship to nature that has the potential to heal climate emergencies. What caused Ms. Pribble to work at a bird sanctuary? Perhaps an encounter with a wild creature, which led to a career and a calling. In nature journalist Richard Liu's book, Our Wild Calling, he writes, a few years ago at an isolated camp on Alaska's Kodiak Island, I walked up a path through the woods at the edge of a still lake. I was heading to the main lodge to meet my son, who worked there during his college summers. The light was fading. Usually when I walked this path, I was watchful. On this island, massive brown bears followed the shoreline, sometimes wandering into the camp. But on this evening, my eyes were down as I thumbed through the contents of my wallet. When I glanced up, I was startled to see 2 piercing eyes. They shone like stars. A black fox stood 3 feet in front of me. The foxes on Kodiak are among the largest in the world. This one was the size of a coyote. Its gaze was disconcerting, and it wasn't budging. We stared at each other for what seemed like minutes. It was probably only seconds. In those eyes, I felt a distant kinship, or perhaps only the sons of a parallel universe. The fox held perfectly still. I stepped forward. The fox moved aside and continued to watch. I lifted my hand and said, "I'm going to the lodge. Would you like to come with me?" Louvre continues, the British writer, painter, and art critic John Berger, in his famous 1977 essay, Why Look at Animals, describes how a wild creature's gaze unnerves us by forcing us to see ourselves across an abyss through an unfamiliar lens. The fox followed me toward the building, he wrote. Several yards from the door, it veered off and dissolved into the high grass. Today, I recall few significant details about most of the people I met that summer in that Alaskan camp, but the black fox's eyes are still watching. For me, it was a barred owl. I was on a hike by myself, intently doing my spiritually merge with nature thing. Some of you know what I mean. Just short of my favorite tree, I had walked this trail countless times. I saw an owl on a low branch, quite close to me. I stopped and held my breath as we held each other's gaze. Well, I couldn't swivel my neck like she did, but her head turned and turned again, and her eyes came back to look at me again and again. It felt like minutes. It was probably seconds. It was time suspended, Kairos time. We connected across the abyss between species. I held still until she flew away. I was transformed by this encounter beyond my ken, yet I felt in that moment we were kin. Owl, heron, kingfisher, fox, opossum, frog. Since the human effect on the natural world is so overwhelming, encounters with wild creatures feel special. And if we are lucky enough to make eye contact, it can feel transformative, a reminder that we are related. I feel blessed every time a hermit thrush allows me to see it forage and flit along the forest floor. I feel seen by it. Of course, that ring around its eye enhances the sensation. But every time I am lucky enough to be near a wild animal or bird, I receive the experience like a visitation from beyond the overpowering presence of humanity. It restores me, and I try not to take it for granted. It might not happen again. Michael V. McGinnis wrote, "Species loneliness in a wounded landscape moves us to want to restore our relationship with place and others. Humanity yearns to reestablish and restore an ecology of shared identity. But we are up against a lot. Dave said he was confident the birds and the critters would return. But will they? In her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Sixth Extinction, science writer Elizabeth Kolbert describes the 5 mass extinctions during the past billion years and interviews the scientists monitoring the 6th extinction, which some predict will be the largest since the time of the dinosaurs. Between 1970 and 2014, the global wildlife population shrank by 60%, according to the World Wildlife Fund. Back in 1999, Winona LaDuke wrote in her book, All Our Relations, "The last 150 years have seen a great holocaust. There have been more species lost in the past 150 years than since the Ice Age. During the same time, indigenous peoples have been disappearing from the face of the earth. Over 2,000 nations of indigenous peoples have gone extinct in the Western Hemisphere, and one nation disappears from the Amazon rainforest each year. There is a direct relationship between the loss of cultural diversity and the loss of biodiversity," she continues. "Wherever indigenous peoples remain, there is also a corresponding enclave of biodiversity. Trickles of rivers still running in the Northwest are home to the salmon still being sung back by the native people. The last few Florida panthers remain in the presence of traditional Seminoles, hidden away in the great cypress swamps of the Everglades. Some of the largest patches of remaining prairie grasses sway on reservation lands. 1/2 of all reservation lands in the United States is still forested, much of it old growth forests. Remnant pristine forest ecosystems from the northern boreal forest to the Everglades largely overlap with native territories. Native American teachings describe the relations all around: animals, fish, trees, and rocks, as our siblings and grandparents. Our relations to each other, our prayers whispered across generations to our relatives, are what bind our cultures together. The protection, teachings, and gifts of our relatives have for generations preserved our families. These relations are honored in ceremony, song, story, and life that keep relations close to buffalo, sturgeon, salmon, turtles, bears, wolves, and panthers. These are our older relatives, the ones who came before and taught us how to live. Their obliteration by dams, guns, and bounties is an immense loss to Native people and their families. Their absence may mean that people sing to a barren river, a caged bear, or buffalo far away. It is the struggle to preserve that which remains and the struggle to recover that characterizes much of Native environmentalism. It is these relationships that industrialism seeks to disrupt. Native communities resist with great determination. As an example, in her book, Trusting Change, Karen Herring writes, "The people of Churin, Mexico, in the past decade have demonstrated the power available in reclaiming their belonging to one another. An indigenous community of 16,000 people, about 200 miles west of Mexico City, Churin has faced threats related to the environment, gun violence, systemic oppression, and dehumanization. In the early 2000s, illegal loggers began clearing the mountain forests surrounding Churin. By 2008, several strong-arm cartels, shored up by corrupt politicians and police, expanded the logging at an alarming and violent rate, earning them the name forest rapists. For 4 years, 200 or more trucks of stolen lumber passed through Churin streets every day, each guarded by bandits armed with AK-47s aimed at the villagers. Extortion, kidnapping, and murders created a zone of fear that quieted resistance, while at least 70% of the trees, in the areas forests were felled and removed. Those who stood up to the loggers and cartels were frequently disappeared. Finally, some of the town's women began gathering surreptitiously to discuss other options. On April 15, 2011, 15 women led an uprising against the cartels, blockading the loggers' pickups as they drove through town. 10 years past the uprising, the LA Times and the BBC reported that Turin remains free of cartels, illegal loggers, and its corrupt leaders. It has recovered many of the old indigenous practices and barred entrance to the community by politicians and state police, and is now governed by a 12-person council that rotates into and out of power. The town has replanted over 3/4 of the surrounding deforested land. They've established one of the largest rainwater collection systems in Latin America and developed a sustainable economy managed by the community. In recent years, the community has experienced almost no violent crime, despite its location in one of the most murder-prone regions of Mexico. Unitarian Universalists cherish the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. It is our challenge in the Anthropocene era, when human impact on nature dominates, for us to respect and protect relationships with the wild flora and fauna beyond our ken, treating them as kin. I believe, as Louvre writes, without contact with other than human kith and kin, the family of humans loses comfort, companionship, and perhaps even the sense of a higher power, however one defines it. Harvard professor E.O. Wilson imagines the logical conclusion of the Anthropocene as a planet on which only people, agriculture, and domesticated animals remain. He asks, will we stop the destruction for future generations, or go on changing the planet to our immediate needs? If the latter, planet Earth will enter a new era of its history, a time for our one species alone. He calls the Anthropocene the age of loneliness. May that not be so. May we nurture connections across that abyss between species, leading to saving relationships on both sides. May climate emergencies bring out the best in us, as Lisa was saved, as she clung to that rock in the ocean, as the birds going extinct were saved by Ms. Pribble. May saving relationships on both sides endure. May climate emergencies bring out the best in us as strangers, help each other over or behind the seawall, as the case may be, saving lives and hope. May that be so.